Jesus Never Existed by Kenneth Humphreys, audiobook version. Chapter 7, 6th section, Rabbinic Judaism Inc. A portable God for the world's first multinational business. Whatever daughter religions might spin off from old Judaism, the parent religion itself had inevitably to refashion itself for the new era. After the disaster of 135 AD, a number of Jews retreated into asceticism, banning meat and wine altogether since sacrifice in the temple was no longer possible. Others lost themselves in mysticism, attempting to reach the, quote, celestial throne via their imagination, Paul would have understood, the forerunners of the later Kabbalah. But for all their suffering, most Jews were not ready to bastardize their traditional creed by infusing it with the dying godman mythology. The vacuum was filled by rabbinic Judaism, the inheritor of the Pharisee tradition. Quote, the rabbis, a smallish group, perhaps 100 or so in the whole Roman Empire, of religious specialists, descended from the Pharisees, gradually enhanced their status, and developed a specifically Jewish way of arguing, which marked them off quite dramatically from both Christians and Romans. Keith Hopkins, A World Full of Gods, page 234. In Palestine itself, where the Jews were now a minority, what remained of traditional Judaism turned inward. No longer could its priests use the, quote, temple magic, once used to summon divine favor. No longer could Judaism be proselytized. Instead, the rabbis became clericalized, obsessed with cultic rules as a practical substitute for the lost temple. They peopled the air itself with beneficent and malign spirits. A Jewish code to live by, the mitzvot, the forerunner of monastic rules, detailed no fewer than 613 rules governing every pious moment from waking to sleeping to keep the Jew on the right side of an all-seeing God. Quote, his rising from his bed, his manner of putting on the different articles of dress, the disposition of his fringed talith, his phylacteries on his head and arms, his ablutions, his meals, even the calls of nature were subjected to scrupulous rules, both reminding him that he was of a peculiar race and perpetually reducing him to ask the advice of the wise men, which alone could set at rest the trembling and scrupulous conscience. Milman, History of the Jews, page 165. Within a few generations, Judaism would be codified anew into a portable, albeit confining, religion, which could accompany and fatally identify this pseudo-race in their wanderings in the centuries ahead. By the close of the 5th century, the total population of Jews would be half of what it was at the beginning of the Christian era. Cantor, the sacred chain. The Jewish people, dispersed but bonded by an exclusive faith uniquely among peoples, established enclaves in every major city from India to Spain, from Arabia to Britain, capitalizing upon this network of safe havens and with a filial presence in every major resource. From African ivory to Germanic slaves, the Jews threw themselves into the commerce of the ancient world. Jewish merchants traversed with impunity the hostile frontiers between Rome and Persia, sailed the sea lanes from the chilly rivers of Germany to the balmy seas off the Horn of Africa. The Jews became dealers in amber and fur, gold and silver, slave traders and money lenders. But they were also dealers in superstition as well as produce. Quote, the empire swarmed with Jewish wonder workers, mathematicians, astrologers, or whatever other name or office they assumed or received from their trembling hearers. Milman, History of the Jews, page 158. Levies on their new wealth paid for a program of synagogue building, and in turn, the synagogue strengthened the bonds of the Jewish communities, rarely assimilating into their host cultures, convinced they were especially favored by the deity and thus strengthened in their faith. The heady mix of piety and mercantilism rewarded the Jews with an unparalleled financial success and an unequaled and universal opprobrium. In the mid-years of the 2nd century, the center of commercial religious Judaism lay on an axis between Palestine and Babylon. The light hand of Rome allowed the displaced Jews of Syria, Palestinia to re-establish their ancestral faith, complete with religious police and a self-appointed hierarchy, with a new corporate headquarters at Tiberias in Galilee. At its head stood a, quote, CEO in the guise of an hereditary patriarch of the West, the recipient of tithes which had once gone to the temple. Every synagogue was visited by legates of the patriarch, called apostles, who collected contributions. As a high dignitary of the empire, the illustrious patriarch shared the status and privileges enjoyed by Rome's consuls, top military commanders, and chief ministers. One provincial governor of Palestine learned the hard way the folly of insulting the patriarch, who outranked him in the official hierarchy. He was executed by the ferocious Christian emperor Theodosius I. Lamented the Christian writer Origen, quote, "Even now, when the Jews are under the dominion of Rome and pay the didrachm, how great, by the permission of Caesar, is the power of their ethnarch. I myself have been a witness that it is little less than that of a king." Milman, History of the Jews, page 149. The patriarch ultimately controlled his far-flung corporation by the power to censure. The issue of an anathema, an excommunication from the chosen people, or a curse, could confer social death. After the fearful cost of rebellions, delinquency was not tolerated. The Jews settled down to business. During the reign of the Emperor Antoninus Pius, 138-161, and under a wary Roman eye, Jewish schools of the law were allowed to reopen. The Jewish scribes began codifying God's ineffable word at the very time Christian scribes were furiously at work writing and revising their own holy stories. Across the Persian, Parthian frontier, another hierarch, the so-called Prince of the Captivity, had also furnished himself with a fabulously appointed ecclesiastic court, financed by the Jews of Persia. Here in Parthia, prestigious centers of Judaism flourished. Quote, "It was Babylonia, with great academies in Sura, Puerpedita, Nehardea, Mehoza, and Nersh, active from 200 CE until the Arab conquest, circa 640 CE, which fashioned that marvelous structure of Jewish law called the Talmud." Albert H. Friedlander. Yet soon after the ascension of Marcus Aurelius, 161, Parthia advanced into Roman Syria and destroyed an entire legion, the 22nd Deotariana, at Eligea on the Armenian frontier. For the second time in a century, Rome was drawn into a costly and protracted conflict over a wide area in the east: Syria, Armenia, Cappadocia, Mesopotamia, and Media. The 5-year war ended in a painful triumph for Rome. Returning troops were to bring plague into the heart of the empire, and in the long term, the withdrawal of legions to fight in the east was to fatally weaken the Danubian front. But with the capture of Ctesiphon, once again Mesopotamian Jews were brought under the dominion of Rome. Unfortunately for them, they threw in their lot with a rebellious Roman commander, Avidius Cassius, which set the normally tolerant Marcus Aurelius against them. As a result of a power struggle between the two pontiffs in the 3rd century, very reminiscent of the conflict between Rome and Constantinople, the Babylonian Jews became subordinate to the Western Patriarch. A business merger, pagan Rome, wearied by recurring rebellions of the Jews, came to regard them with suspicion and disdain. But the Christian empire, which was to follow, refined this contempt into a bloody hatred. Though tolerated for their commercial usefulness, the Jews would ever after face the murderous intent of those who were, quote, loving servants of the Lord.